On June 8, 2007, Diane Johnson was doing her job delivering mail in St. Charles, Missouri when she stumbled across a horrifying scene. When she got to a commercial building on First Capitol Drive, she delivered mail to each of the businesses until she got to Unit 295. That was the location of a Brooke Auto Insurance franchise owned and operated by Robert Eidman. There she saw Robert lying on the floor in a pool of blood, so she ran out to the road and flagged down a police officer. After the officer rushed to the scene, Robert was determined to be dead, and it was clearly a homicide. It was clear that Robert had died from a gunshot wound to the head, but what wasn't clear was exactly why. When detectives started digging into the Eidmans, they discovered a similar murder and a secret second life. This is Monsters. Robert Eidman, who went by Bob, was born on July 18, 1958 in nearby St. Louis. He was described as an outgoing young man who had a bit of a defiant streak. He met a woman named Diane Bowling in high school and they got married in the mid-80s. The couple never had any children. Bob had been selling insurance for decades and Diane worked in nutrition for St. John's Mercy Medical Center. Bob decided he wanted to be his own boss, so he opened a franchise of Brooke Auto Insurance about a year before his murder. People who knew him said that the business was struggling and he was worried about his future. He specialized in providing insurance to high-risk individuals, and some believe he may have been being a little too risky with his clientele. He would often accept monthly payments in cash and store the money in a locked cabinet in his office. Theft was definitely a motive the investigators considered early on. Homicide detectives were called in to investigate the murder where they found Bob lying on the floor of a small commercial office. It was a building with a number of businesses ranging from the small insurance office to a medium-sized Mexican food market. There was a row of businesses on the upper level where Bob's office was. Then if you drove around to the other side of the building, there was another row of businesses on the lower level. Bob had been shot 3 times with one bullet grazing his chin, a second bullet hitting him in the neck, and one hitting him in the head. A ballistics technician later determined the most likely murder weapon was a Glock 9mm. When the investigators searched the office, they found about $200 in cash in the cabinet drawer, but when they searched his body, they noticed that his wallet was not on him. It was not located anywhere in the office. The unit directly under Bob's office was a printing business run by Deborah Kennedy, who told investigators that she heard at least 2 loud bangs at about 12 p.m. that day. People in the other businesses in the building as well as a nearby apartment complex were interviewed, but they said they hadn't heard or seen anything. The market next door to Bob's office hadn't heard the gunshots, but they did have a surveillance camera at the back of the store that pointed to the front door. When investigators watched the footage, they saw the postal worker deliver the mail at 12:38 p.m. When they ran the footage back, they saw what they believed was a white Ford Focus drive by the door at 11:50 a.m. Then it drove by again, a little slower at 11:54 a.m., just before Deborah Kennedy had heard the shots. So investigators started looking into any connection Bob might have had to someone owning that make and model of car. With thousands of registered white Ford Focuses in the state, though, it wouldn't be easy. While that was happening, Diane had arrived at the scene after being notified of her husband's murder. 2 detectives gave her a ride to an assisted living facility where Diane could inform Bob's parents about his death in person. While driving, they also interviewed Diane where she immediately made an alarming statement. She said, quote, "I have to tell you guys something. I don't want you to take this as a confession or anything, but the same thing happened to my dad." On April 6, 1984, 51-year-old Jerome Bowling was shot in his home in St. Louis. He was a patrol officer for the St. Louis Police Department and was rushed to the hospital but died of his injuries. His wife Lenora, Diane's mother, told the police that someone had broken into the home, found Jerome's service revolver, and shot him with it. The first officer on the scene would say Lenora didn't seem distraught about her husband's condition, and investigators found the story about the intruder finding Jerome's service weapon unlikely. Lenora said she had seen a black man stalking their house in the days before the murder, and in the home they found a note that said, quote, "This is for you, pig, for what you've done to me." It seemed strange that the assailant was prepared with a note but not a weapon. Lenora was arrested and charged with her husband's murder. While she was awaiting trial, she moved in with Bob and Diane, and Bob wasn't a fan of having a possible murderer in his home. Friends said that he would lock the bedroom door at night when he went to bed because he was scared of his mother-in-law. But in the end, Lenora was acquitted of the murder as, despite the case being strange, there was no evidence she had killed Jerome. 2 decades later, Diane would be under suspicion of killing her husband just like her mother had been. While Diane was being driven to her in-laws, the detectives asked standard questions. They asked about Bob's daily routine and, of course, if she knew of anyone who wanted to hurt him. They also asked about insurance policies, and Diane told the investigators that she knew that she had a small policy through her work and that Bob might have also had a small policy, but she wasn't sure about the details. Bob's father would confirm that he knew about a life insurance policy on Bob for $5,000. Investigators would later learn that Bob actually had life insurance policies that would pay out a total of $300,000, but they didn't know if Diane had lied or if she didn't know about them. Authorities also became suspicious of Bob and Diane's relationship when they learned that a man named Michael Mann was living with them and that Bob had been going out of town frequently to meet a friend. But before they dug into that lead more, there was a major break in the case. A few days after Bob's murder, a white 4-door Saturn was found abandoned after it had crashed less than a mile from Bob's insurance office. The investigators had thought the vehicles in the surveillance footage was a Ford Focus, but the models were similar enough that they believed it could have been the Saturn that had crashed, especially since one of Bob's business cards was found inside the vehicle. When a detective ran the registration, it came back to a man named Travis Ensley, and records show he had an insurance policy through Brook Insurance. It also showed that he had a record for driving under the influence. As the detective headed to Travis's apartment to question him, he radioed in to have the vehicle checked to see if it was reported stolen. He was told that Travis had just called in to make that very report. When he arrived, Travis said he was sure that he had parked his car in the parking lot of his apartment before going inside and going to sleep. When he went outside that morning to get some breakfast, he realized the car was gone. He had the key and assured the detective that he had locked the door when he parked. Then he told them that he had recently gotten insurance from the guy that was murdered and wasn't sure who to call to make a claim. It sounded like Travis was on the level, but if someone had just stolen his car, then they wouldn't have been able to use it to murder Bob, as that was 2 days prior. The detective asked if he could look in his apartment, and Travis agreed. Inside Travis's bedroom, the detective double-checked that everything in the room was his, and Travis said yes. Then the detective picked up a red soccer jersey with white lettering with what looked to be blood on it. When he asked Travis what shirt he had been wearing the day before, Travis said he was wearing that jersey. Travis was placed under arrest, and as he was taken out to the police vehicle, he was informed that the authorities had his car at their impound lot. At that point, Travis likely believed he was caught driving under the influence once again, but things were much worse. Once at the police station, Travis admitted that he had been out driving the night before and crashed his car just up the street from his apartment. When the detective asked why he didn't call the police, he said he didn't want to get caught driving drunk again. The detective asked him if he had been injured in the crash, and Travis said no, but when he was told about the blood on his shirt, he posited that the airbag deployed and it caused a bloody nose. He said all he remembered was being in a daze and stumbling home. When the detective asked about Bob's business card, Travis said a friend recommended Bob because he dealt with high-risk insurance, and Travis fit that category. I know, you're shocked. Authorities were skeptical of the story, but after testing the blood and having it only come back as a match to Travis and then verifying his alibi for the time of the murder, he was marked off the suspect list. He was still punished for driving under the influence and leaving the scene of an accident. With that lead gone, investigators went back to digging into Bob's past, and when they started working their way through his browser history and emails, they were shocked at what they found. After getting warrants to the service providers for the various information, the first thing they received was his internet history. The 3 websites that stood out were geared towards finding sexual partners. 2 of the 3 were actually owned by parent company Adult Friend Finder. Investigators also found communications for various sexual services through the local newspaper's Adult Services Classified section. Similar communications were found to have happened through Craigslist as well. What stood out to the investigators was that it seemed that Bob was looking for sexual opportunities with other men. After going through Bob's emails and phone records, they found one person who stood out more than others, a man named Kurt Kressler. When detectives interviewed Kurt, they learned that he had met Bob on a telephone dating service in October of 2006, and since they lived about 3 hours apart, they would regularly meet in Columbia, about 100 miles or 160 kilometers west of St. Charles. Kurt said that he had never met Diane, but she did know that they were quote-unquote friends and that Bob would spend the occasional weekend in Columbia with him. Kurt said that Bob and Diane did get in a fight about him in February. Detectives were curious because when they asked Diane if there had been any problems in their marriage, she said no. When Diane was asked about the argument, she explained that she had seen some emails that Bob had sent to Kurt and she believed they were fairly intimate. She said she didn't mean in a sexual way, but Bob had been telling Kurt about private problems that she had not heard him mention to her. She felt hurt and said they had discussed the situation but claimed it wasn't a fight. During the interview, she asked the detective if her husband was gay. She explained that she had asked him outright after finding the email and he had said no. He told her that Kurt was just a work friend. Since Kurt was seen on a surveillance video at work 3 hours away at the time of Bob's murder, he was cleared as a suspect. But the idea that Diane might have suspected an affair with the insurance payout she hadn't told them about pushed her to the top of their suspect list. Authorities asked Diane to take a polygraph, which she did, and the results were deemed inconclusive. Otherwise, there was no evidence that Diane had killed Bob or had him killed, and investigators were at a dead end. The case was cold for about 3 years before detectives got a new lead. When Bob's clothes were collected from the coroner after the murder, on a whim, a forensic technician decided to swab the inside of Bob's back pocket, where Diane said he normally kept his wallet. Investigators were sure that someone had reached into his back pocket to steal his wallet, and there was a chance that person had left some skin cells or sweat behind. In 2010, 2 DNA profiles were pulled from the swab from Bob's back pocket. One was Bob's, but the other was an unknown male. When it was put into the system, it returned a result the same day, and it wasn't anybody who had been mentioned in the investigation. The DNA belonged to a man named Paul White, and Paul was not hard to find as he was serving time in prison on a forgery conviction.
So, going from, going to DOC when you're a young kid, doing a robbery, getting out, and then you're back for forgeries, that's kind of a change of path. You're kind of a grown man now. What forgeries need money?
It was just something stupid, man. This girl, she had some checks, and I went up to a couple of schnooks and wrote a couple of checks for cash back. Just stupid, and ended up getting some time for it.
Were you doing it just for the money, or did you have a drug problem, or what?
No, I've never been on drugs. It was just basically for the money, just something stupid.
Something stupid. Probably the most common motivation for crime in the world. Paul White was born on October 15, 1976, and seems to have lived in the St. Louis area. His criminal record started at a young age, with him verifying at the beginning of his interview that he went straight from his mother's house to prison the first time. That conviction was for armed robbery committed in early 1994 when he was 17 years old, which resulted in a 15-year prison sentence. While in prison, Paul started dating a woman from St. Charles named Sherry Nelson, and they ended up getting married a few months before Paul was released. After being released on August 9, 2006, he moved to St. Charles. Through his wife, he met a man named Cleo Hines, and the two started hanging out. While Paul was still in prison, Sherry got insurance on her vehicle through Bob. Then they went back multiple times after Paul was released to change the policy and then get insurance on other vehicles. So they had repeated business with Bob. That made it suspicious when Paul initially claimed he didn't know Bob. He didn't recognize the name and saw two different photos before he admitted he might look familiar. The detectives went to the correctional facility to interview Paul on September 27, 2010, and before he was brought in, they put a camera in the room. Though it wasn't necessarily hidden, they didn't tell him the interview was being recorded. They went over timelines, ensuring that Paul was available at the time of the murder. He was out of prison, and his work schedule did not provide him with an alibi. Then they tried to see how much Paul would admit knowing about the crime. Obviously, he denied knowing Bob, but after getting into his and his wife's history with Brook Insurance, he changed his story. When the detective started poking around to see how much Paul knew about Bob accepting cash payments, he tried to make it seem like he had no idea.
You guys had insurance through Brooks Insurance. Do you remember how you guys would make payments to them?
Like a credit card.
Put on a credit card?
Yeah.
Now, would you go in and present the credit card to him?
I think he just did it like over the computer or something.
Okay. But would you be there while he did, or would you do it over? Would you call him up and say?
I only went like one time, like when she first got insurance, and like we went in there and it was, I think it was when she first got her Malibu, or it might have been, I don't remember which car it was on, but we went in there one time and it was like on the credit card, I'm sure, and that was that.
While reviewing evidence from the scene, it was discovered that some auto insurance paperwork had been found sitting on Bob's desk. That paperwork was for insurance policies written in late April of 2007 for a 2005 Chevy Malibu and a 1998 Chevy Monte Carlo operated by Sherry White, Paul's wife. The down payment and broker fee for that policy was paid with a credit card, like Paul claimed during his interview. That wasn't the only policy Sherry had, though. In September of 2006, she had gotten insurance on a 2004 Jeep Liberty. Now, if you're married or living with someone, the insurance policy will assume that person will also drive the vehicle, and it could affect your rate. At that time, Sherry had signed a clause saying Paul would not be an insured driver, so I think that was her car at the time, and she eventually got different cars later, and I think Paul ended up driving one of those vehicles. That policy was rewritten in early April, possibly to then include Paul, but it's not clear what exactly was changed. Bob's record showed that on April 2nd, $185 was paid in cash to start the policy. So the fact that Bob did accept cash payments at his office was known to Paul. It's believed that Bob saw Paul approaching the office and remembered him from having done business with him multiple times in the previous 9 months. He quickly grabbed the paperwork from his files so he would be ready for whatever Paul was there to talk about. During his interview, Paul suggested that the paperwork could have been out because Sherry made a payment, but there was no record of a payment by Sherry being made that day. When they interviewed her later, she said she always paid in person at Bob's office with either cash or a credit card, and she had not been there the day of the murder. The detectives did something kinda weird in their interview, though. They did match the DNA found in Bob's back pocket to the DNA taken from Paul when he was sent to prison for his current sentence, but they didn't tell him about the match, at least not right away. They claimed they needed to get a DNA sample from him to compare to the DNA in Bob's pocket, and the reason they were asking him was since there was a record of him being in Bob's office. They gave him some story about needing to have taken the sample themselves to make sure it couldn't be questioned in court, which may be true, but it sent up red flags for Paul. He was not buying the story, and he had also noticed the camera they had set up in the room. Eventually, they realized he was calling their bluff, and they showed him the report that indicated that his DNA that was collected by the Department of Corrections matched the DNA recovered from Bob's back pocket. Paul was sure that there was no way that his DNA could have been in Bob's back pocket.
Listen. I just showed you.
I understand that, but I ain't nowhere in the world.
Why don't you think that?
It's because I never. You said that he got robbed. I never robbed the guy. I've been in there one time and to get insurance, so that's
exactly.
Ain't nowhere in the world.
You're telling me you've been in there one time.
Yeah.
And your DNA shows up in this guy's back pocket a month later?
That don't even make sense.
Exactly. With your story, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't, Paul. I mean, it's one of these things that right now, when I show this to you, I show it to my boss, and I show it to the prosecutor, they're all on board on this, and they're saying, you know what, there's no way. I mean, you guys weren't romantically involved together, were you?
Come on, man.
I mean, exactly. I mean, my job is to prove people innocent, and my job is to prove people guilty. You told me in the beginning of this you're heterosexual.
Right.
Okay, I believe you're heterosexual. I don't think you've ever had a homosexual relationship with anybody. I mean, if you have, tell me now.
Nah.
Okay. All right. So, you know, there's several different ways for DNA to get passed. Okay. Or there's several different kinds of DNA, I should say. You know, there's sweat, there's skin cells, there's semen, there's saliva. You know, I told you as you're coming in here, you know, you got hairs falling through your pants leg. You know, every time you touch this chair, the arm rails with your bare skin, you're leaving, you know, droplets of microscopic sweat. Even though if you don't think you're sweating, you are. You know, you brush up against something, skin cells fall off on that chair. You know, it's the way we're composed. Now, if you can think of a reason that your DNA would be in his pocket other than the way I've got it in my mind, I'm willing to listen.
Paul continued to admit he understood what the DNA report said, but he claimed it was impossible that his DNA was there. And it would be one thing if they were lying. Investigators are allowed to lie to a suspect in order to get a confession. These investigators would do just that in order to get information from another person later. They weren't lying about the DNA, though. There was DNA, possibly a combination of skin cells and sweat, inside Bob's back pocket that came back a match to two people, Bob and Paul. There were very few reasonable ways Paul's DNA could have gotten inside the pocket. If the DNA was on the outside, he could have brushed up against Bob, or maybe they brushed up against the same thing. Inside, though, Paul would have either had to reach into that pocket, or maybe he had handled something that Bob later placed into his back pocket. Which one seemed more likely? Paul was relentless at denying any involvement, and most of it didn't make sense.
And Dave, you're saying a robbery.
It's the same incident, dude.
Okay, but listen to this. You're saying a robbery. A robbery.
All right.
So a person is gonna rob somebody. Is gonna rob him. Does that make sense? Seriously, if I'm gonna do a robbery, I haven't done a robbery since '94. But if I'm gonna do a robbery and risk going back to prison for a robbery, because I know you get 15 years better, and then it's gonna be my second one, so I know I'm gonna get a lot of time. If I'm gonna do a robbery, I'm gonna at least try to rob a bank or something where it at least be worth the money. You know what I mean? I mean, come on now. You're not. I've done stuff, wrote some checks. That wasn't worth coming to this for. I hated every day that I'm here because I wrote those stupid checks for a couple of $100. You know what I mean? That's not worth coming to prison for 3 years for. Well, I got a 6-year sentence, but I got to do 3 years for it. You know what I mean? And every day I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about how I'm missing my daughter. You know what I mean? And how I ruined things between me and my wife over this. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, I'm got to the point to where it's like, man, all this shit is not worth it. You know what I'm saying?
His defense was that he wouldn't risk going to prison for a few $100s, but he was literally in prison for forgery where he had stolen a few $100s. He makes it sound like his current time in prison had made him realize a few $100s wasn't worth it, but the crime he was serving time for happened after he robbed Bob. So all this defense has done was show that it was absolutely possible he would have committed the robbery at the time. Another poor attempt to defend himself went like this.
I mean, okay, when I was 17, yeah, I committed a robbery. You know what I mean? I was with a guy, and we robbed the cleaners, and we left. A couple of days later, we ended up getting locked up. I told the detectives what happened before he did. You know, he denied everything. I told him what happened. You know
I
what
ran
I mean?
that for some police.
And we both got locked up. He ended up getting probation. I got 15 years. So I went to prison. I came out. I committed a forgery, no one. Wrote some checks, you know what I mean? I went back to prison and ended up completing that sentence. But then I called it forgery again in 08, you know what I mean? But I've never robbed anybody else.
Officer, sure I committed armed robbery, then forgery again, but you have to trust me that I didn't commit any other crimes. He tried to make himself sound better by saying this.
When we robbed the cleaners, there wasn't even any bullets in the gun. We had a gun, but there wasn't even any bullets in the gun. I wouldn't have, man, okay. That's no way in the world.
That clerk, did she show up in court?
Yeah, she came to court.
Did she ID you?
Yeah.
The detective implied that he committed murder because he didn't want to leave a witness, like his previous robbery. And to be fair, Paul responded by saying he had confessed before the clerk had ID'd him. But the point is that he had that knowledge. The next time he planned to rob someone, it was reasonable that he might think, that clerk was going to ID me in court, I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen this time. It didn't matter though. Paul was adamant that he was not responsible for the murder, and he finally agreed to give the detectives another DNA sample. According to Paul, the fact that he had a record for armed robbery and theft, he had been to Bob's office, a surveillance camera picked up a white Ford Focus at the time of the murder, his friend Cleo Hines had purchased a white Ford Focus about a month before the crime, and his DNA being inside Bob's back pocket were all a coincidence. Not only that, but Cleo had been pulled over not long after the murder driving the white Ford Focus, and Paul was in the car with him at the time. They noted that the car had Illinois plates on it, and in the surveillance video, the plates weren't clear enough to read, but they looked like they were Illinois plates, not Missouri plates. It turned out that, when Cleo purchased the car, he couldn't afford to register it, so he put some old plates from his girlfriend's car on it. Not surprisingly, he was eventually pulled over for having expired registration. By the time Paul was interviewed, Cleo was already at the station awaiting questioning. When the detective spoke to him, they told him the lie I mentioned earlier.
There's a video camera inside the Mexican grocery store watching the people at the cash register. Yeah. But if the door's closed, you can't see out. The doors are open. So I seen you pull in. Now, you didn't just pull around once, did you?
No, like twice.
You pulled around twice, and that's on camera. Yeah. And then you pulled up.
Now, that was more of a lie of omission. The detectives told Cleo his car was on camera, and they made it sound like it was more definite than it was. It looked like his car, but he believed the video showed it was definitely his car. Because of that, he quickly confessed to what had happened, but he said Paul forced him to participate. Cleo lived with Paul and Sherry. According to him, he worked the night shift, so on June 8, 2007, he was asleep in his room when Paul came in and pointed a gun at him. When Cleo was asked what type of gun it was, he said it was a Glock 9mm, the same gun suspected in the murder. He said Paul made him get up and drive him somewhere. He said they first went to Walmart and Paul was going to follow someone out to their car and rob them, but he changed his mind. Then he told Cleo to drive him to the insurance office. They pulled around the first time and Paul was looking into the window to see if Bob was there. Then they pulled around again and Cleo stopped in front of the office.
What happens now?
He goes in for like 5 minutes.
Okay.
Comes back out.
Does he run out? Does he walk out?
He walked out like calmly.
Okay.
He had a wallet.
Okay. The wallet in his hand?
So I'm like,
How much money do you think he had?
it wasn't even enough money to rob anybody for. Like $200 maybe.
Okay. It was cash.
It was cash.
Okay. Was it 20s, 100s, 50s? You remember?
I think it's 20s, maybe a 40.
Okay. Pretty. I mean, that's a lot of money to me. I mean, I'm a cop. I don't make
Yeah, but
$1 million.
you can work for that.
Right.
Right.
So, I mean, did it look like a big wad of cash, or was there some? Okay. So, just a.
Yeah, just a few 20s.
Okay. So he comes walking out. What's he do with the wallet?
This is what he did. When we got home, he took it. He burned it in the barbecue grill.
Okay. What about the credit cards and stuff inside?
He left all of that inside and he burned it all.
Okay.
Cleo told the detective that Paul had been wearing a pair of white cotton gloves when he went into Bob's office. That was likely why Paul was so sure he hadn't left DNA behind, but he did. Again, the detectives weren't lying and experts believe he left skin cells on the outside of the gloves when he handled them before putting them on and then transferred them into the pocket when he grabbed the wallet. They also explained it was possible for sweat to soak through the cotton. Nowadays, investigators are able to get DNA from such small amounts that even wearing gloves is not a guarantee that you won't leave evidence behind. You won't leave fingerprints, but there could still be DNA on the gloves from you touching them while you put them on. Cleo claimed that they went straight to a casino and Paul lost the stolen money in about an hour. Apparently, Paul had a bit of a gambling problem. Cleo said that Paul gambled all the time and he won some money a few times, but more often lost. Investigators ended up finding out that in the early morning hours before the murder, Paul had lost $1,200 at Casino Queen. When they spoke with casino security, they confirmed that Paul bought in at the blackjack tables with $1,200 at 2:20 a.m. on June 8th and then cashed out with $0 only 25 minutes later. It's believed he became desperate to find some money to return to the casino and try to win back the $1,200 he had lost. Cleo said that they eventually left the casino and went back to their apartment where Paul used a charcoal grill to burn the gloves and Bob's wallet. Cleo said that all of Bob's credit cards and his ID were in the wallet when it burned. Paul had only removed the cash. When detectives went back to Paul on September 29th and told him that Cleo had given them a full confession, he claimed Cleo was lying, which would be important for later. Paul continued to deny any involvement in the murder and the detectives left with no new information. It was when they returned on October 14th with an arrest warrant that Paul finally changed his tune. Paul claimed that he had been there during the murder, but he had not been the one who killed Bob. According to Paul, he and Cleo both went into the office and demanded money from Bob. When he didn't hand any over fast enough, Cleo shot him once and demanded money. When Bob claimed he didn't have any, Cleo shot him again. Paul said he was surprised and warned Cleo that he was going to kill Bob, so Cleo responded by firing the fatal blow to the head. Paul said he reached into Bob's back pocket, took his wallet, and they left. But that version of events left a lot of questions. Like, if Cleo had committed the murder, why wouldn't Paul have said that when he learned that Cleo had confessed? He was told that Cleo had pointed the finger at him for murder and his first instinct was to say he was lying. Why would he say that if Cleo had been the one who killed Bob? I know it's impossible to know for sure, but during Cleo's interview, it just feels more like he's genuinely describing what he believed happened secondhand, as opposed to someone describing what happened and pretending to have only heard the details. If that makes sense. It feels to me like Paul was the one who pulled the trigger and that Cleo wasn't in the office, but Cleo was not without fault. A detective asked him why he didn't leave when Paul went into Walmart, then why he didn't leave when Paul went into the office. I do feel like Cleo wasn't the shooter, but I feel like he wasn't forced into the crime as he wanted investigators to believe. At the end of the day, it became very clear that Diane had nothing to do with her husband's death.
Do you know a woman named Diane?
No,
You don't know a woman named Diane either?
no.
Paul denied knowing anyone named Diane, and it seemed like he was genuinely confused by the question. I think it's likely he believed that this Diane person may have said something incriminating about him, so he wanted to remove any connection to her. Obviously, investigators didn't want to rule out the possibility that Paul had killed Bob for Diane, but he clearly had no idea who she was. When Paul finally admitted to being involved with the murder, his defense was that Cleo had pulled the trigger. If Diane had hired him to murder her husband, it seemed like he would have flipped on her at that point. It turned out that Diane hadn't known about the larger life insurance policy on Bob, and yes, there had been a recent strain on the marriage involving Bob's affair, but she hadn't known how serious the affair really was at the time, and it wasn't a motive for murder. Paul White pleaded not guilty and went to trial, where the jury only deliberated for 2.5 hours before finding him guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree robbery. Paul was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murder and a life sentence for the robbery. Cleo Hines entered an Alford plea, which meant he was not admitting guilt but accepted that there was enough evidence to convict him. That plea was for second-degree murder and first-degree robbery, and Cleo was also given 2 life sentences, but they both came with the possibility of parole. His first chance at parole will be in 2034. Paul ended Bob Eidman's life for a few $100s, which is bad enough. But he also destroyed the lives of the people who loved Bob. A ripple of suffering because Paul couldn't control himself in a casino. If you find yourself struggling with a gambling addiction, there are places you can go to seek help. Don't turn into a monster and try to solve your problems at the expense of other people's lives. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.